The mysterious invitation. It was a damp evening in early autumn, the sort of evening when fog clings to the cobblestone streets, and the gaslights barely cut through the haze. London seemed to sag beneath the weight of the cold air, and a general sense of quiet brooded over the city, broken only by the occasional clink of carriage wheels or the muffled sound of a distant street organ. Chapter 1. I had just finished a modest dinner and was preparing to settle in for an evening of reading, when a letter arrived at my door. The envelope was heavy in my hand, the paper thick and textured, almost regal. Its deep red wax seal bore an intricate emblem, a dagger entwined with ivy. It was not a seal I recognized, nor was the handwriting familiar. There was a peculiar elegance to it, a neatness that suggested it was from someone accustomed to wealth or status, yet it carried an air of mystery that set my nerves tingling. I hesitated, almost not wanting to open it. I had become accustomed to the quieter, simpler cases that filled my days. And something about this letter suggested that this would not be one of those. But curiosity, as always, got the better of me. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter with care. It was brief, yet there was an urgency in the words that immediately gripped me. Dr. Watson, you are requested at once for a matter of great delicacy and grave importance. Come to the address below at your earliest convenience. Your presence is required urgently. Yours sincerely, C.O. There were no further details, no explanations. I turned the letter over, but the reverse was plain. It was not a typical invitation, not something one would expect from any gentleman of good standing. Yet the weight of the words pressed on me, urging immediate action. Without a second thought, I donned my coat, grabbed my hat, and made my way toward the address, scribbled hastily at the bottom of the page. The location was in one of the darker parts of London, far from the more familiar districts I frequented. It was a stretch of the city I had passed through only in passing, where old buildings leaned precariously toward one another, and the air carried the faintest scent of decay. As I walked through the damp alleys, I could not shake the feeling that something was amiss, as though the city itself was conspiring against me. The once grand townhouses were now cloaked in shadows, their windows darkened and their facades peeling. When I reached the address, it was as though time had frozen. The building stood at the end of a narrow, seemingly forgotten street, its stoic exterior battered by years of neglect. The door was large and made of oak, weathered to a dull, gray hue. It was unmarked, uninviting, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of its silence as I pushed it open. The hinges groaned with a sound that echoed down the alley behind me, and I stepped into the dim hallway beyond. A manservant awaited me at the top of the stairs, his face inscrutable. Without a word, he gestured for me to follow, and I complied, my footsteps heavy on the creaking wood beneath me. We climbed 2 flights of stairs before reaching a door that, unlike the rest of the house, seemed freshly painted. The manservant opened it silently, revealing a large, sparse room illuminated by a single gaslight, its flame flickering nervously as though afraid of the shadows. The furniture was sparse, elegant, but worn. A heavy velvet curtain hung by the window, casting the room in a muted light. And in the far corner stood a marble mantelpiece with a small fire crackling lazily within. But it was not the room that caught my attention. It was what stood against the wall opposite, a glass display case. Inside it lay a dagger. It was not an ordinary weapon, to be sure. Its hilt was made of silver, the design intricate and flowing, resembling a vine entwined around the handle. The blade itself was long and narrow, gleaming unnervingly sharp in the dim glow. But it was the dark crimson stain on its edge that sent an uncomfortable shiver down my spine. The stain looked fresh, and yet there was an unnatural stillness to it, as if the blade had been positioned precisely for display rather than in use. A figure stepped into the room, drawing my attention away from the dagger. Its tall frame was unmistakable, as was the air of quiet command that seemed to surround him. Sherlock Holmes, of course. Only he could call upon me in such an unexpected manner, and only he would have the ability to conjure up such a peculiar scene. "Dr. Watson," Holmes said, his voice smooth, yet with an edge of urgency. "I trust you have not been delayed." I took a step toward him, my gaze flickering back to the dagger. "Sherlock, I didn't expect you to be the one to summon me," I replied, my tone more curious than surprised. "But the dagger? Is this the cause of the summons? What is this?" Holmes did not immediately answer. Instead, he moved toward the display case, his long, deft fingers tracing the glass as though searching for something hidden beyond the obvious. He was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowed in deep concentration. "This," he said at last, his voice measured but intense, "is not merely an object of curiosity, Watson. It has been used, and not long ago. You see, this very dagger is connected to a death that I believe you will find most curious." I stepped closer, my pulse quickening. "A death, but this dagger—" "Yes," Holmes interrupted, his gaze lifting from the glass. "The victim is dead, but the circumstances surrounding his death are far stranger than they first appear. This dagger, which to the untrained eye might seem to be an ornament, is, in fact, a weapon with a long, bloody history. The problem, however, is not just that the weapon has been used, it's that no one knows it's been used, Watson, not until now." Glanced at the dagger again, the crimson stain now appearing all the more ominous. "Then the question is, why was this particular dagger used, and by whom?" Holmes remained still for a moment, his eyes flicking over the room. "A question I intend to answer, but not yet. The answers lie not only in this weapon, but in the man who wielded it and in the man who now lies dead." I could feel the tension in the room rise as Holmes continued to study the display case, his mind working tirelessly behind his calm demeanor. He had already formulated his theories, but I could sense that he was holding something back. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they had not yet been arranged. He turned to me with a gleam in his eyes. "I require your assistance, Watson. You must come with me to investigate the scene of the crime. There are things there that will tell us more than the victim's body ever could, and once we have gathered all the facts, we can begin to untangle the mystery of the dagger." I hesitated, unsure of what lay ahead, but knew that with Holmes, there was no turning back once the game was afoot. "Very well," I said, my voice steady. "Let's begin." Holmes nodded curtly, his mind already moving to the next step of his investigation. "We leave immediately," he said. I followed him out of the room, my mind racing with questions, but one thing was certain. This would not be a simple case. And the dagger, with its sinister stain, would be the key to unlocking a mystery that no one could have predicted. Scene of the crime, we left the house with little fanfare, the sound of the door closing behind us carrying an almost portentous weight. Holmes moved swiftly, with purpose, his every step precise, as though he were already enacting a plan in his mind. I, on the other hand, found myself glancing about. The fog of London swirling around us, thickening the air and obscuring the street lamps. Despite the chill that had descended upon the city, the fog seemed to cling to my very thoughts, as if something hidden within it was just out of reach, tantalizingly out of sight. Holmes did not speak again until we reached the carriage that awaited us at the curb. It was an unmarked vehicle, the dark wood and black leather seats scarcely visible beneath the mist. Holmes climbed in first, his movements deliberate, and I followed, sitting across from him. The door slammed shut behind me, and we were off. The trip was short, but far from uneventful. We passed through several districts, each more squalid than the last. The further we went from the heart of the city, the more run down the area seemed to become. Old buildings, some of which were still functional, others collapsing under the weight of neglect, pressed in on either side. It was a world far removed from the glittering streets of Mayfair, where the wealthy and well-connected resided. As we approached our destination, Holmes remained silent, his gaze fixed on the window. I had no doubt that his mind was working through the facts he had already collected, rearranging them, making deductions based on his usual impeccable reasoning. I could not, however, escape the sense that something was coming, something I had not yet anticipated. When the carriage finally stopped, it was at the entrance to a crumbling building on the outskirts of the city. The front door was plain, but the windows above it had been boarded up, and the entire structure seemed as if it had been abandoned for years. A sudden chill seemed to settle in my bones as I disembarked, the damp air biting at my skin. Holmes led the way up the steps, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. I followed closely behind, my mind racing. The fog, now thicker than ever, seemed to cling to the ground, swirling around our ankles as if it were alive, shifting and undulating with an unseen force. The door creaked as Holmes pushed it open, and we stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell, a combination of mildew, stale air, and something far more metallic. It was faint, but it carried the unmistakable scent of blood, and it made my stomach lurch involuntarily. Holmes, however, seemed unaffected by the odor, and he moved with swift confidence, heading down a narrow hallway to the left. We passed several rooms, their doors ajar, revealing little more than the detritus of time and abandonment. Finally, Holmes stopped before one particular door, its frame cracked and warped, the paint peeling away in large, uneven strips. He pushed the door open and gestured for me to enter. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a single, flickering gaslight in the corner. There was a large, four-poster bed against the far wall, and a desk littered with papers and other odds and ends. But it was not the room's furnishings that immediately drew my attention. It was the body. The victim lay sprawled on the floor near the bed, his limbs twisted at odd angles, the remnants of his life slowly pooling beneath him. His clothes, though once fine, were now torn and bloodied. His face, though partially obscured by blood, held an expression of deep confusion, as though he had not understood what had happened to him. The dagger. I saw it immediately. It was embedded in the man's chest, the hilt protruding at an angle that suggested a forceful thrust. The blade was unmistakably silver hilt, intricate design, and the unmistakable crimson stain that marred its sharp edge. This was the same weapon we had seen in the display case, the one that had brought us here. Holmes crouched down beside the body, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings with a practiced ease. His fingers, long and delicate, pressed against the victim's clothing, and I saw him make several quick deductions from the way the man's garments were arranged, the position of his limbs, and the way he had fallen. I deduce, Holmes murmured, more to himself than to me, that this was no struggle. The man did not die immediately from the blow. The victim likely collapsed after being struck, but his posture suggests he remained conscious for some time after the attack. He paused, running his hand lightly over the fabric of the victim's shirt. Notice the lack of defensive wounds. This was not a case of a desperate struggle. I knelt beside him, my gaze fixed on the body, unable to tear my eyes away from the violent scene. But how did the murderer get so close to him without the victim reacting? Surely he would have fought back. Holmes gave me a long, knowing look before turning his attention back to the body. That, my dear Watson, is the question. And I believe we are about to uncover the answer. I watched as he continued his investigation, moving from one point to another with swift deliberation. His eyes swept across the room, stopping at the desk and then the bed before falling to the floor again. His sharp gaze narrowed as he inspected the floorboards near the body. Interesting, Holmes murmured, kneeling down to examine the floor. He ran his fingers along the edge of the wooden planks, his expression now one of deep concentration. It appears that the murderer had an accomplice. You see, Watson, the victim, was not alone when he was attacked. The marks on the floor here suggest that someone else was standing near him, someone who assisted in restraining him. An accomplice? I asked, leaning in to examine the marks for myself. The faint scratches on the wood did indeed suggest that someone had been standing at the victim's side, holding him still as the fatal blow was delivered. Holmes nodded, his face illuminated by the flickering gaslight. Precisely. The victim was not the intended target initially. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The real target was someone else, but for reasons I am yet to understand. This man was the one who paid the price. As Holmes stood and walked toward the window, I continued to examine the room. The clues beginning to fall into place in my mind, but the mystery deepened with every passing moment. The victim's identity, his role in all of this, and the significance of the dagger all swirled together in a complex puzzle that I could not yet solve. Holmes turned toward me, his eyes sharp as ever. We need to find out who this man is, Watson, and why he was chosen as the victim. The dagger and the history it holds will reveal far more than we can yet imagine. The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. We had only just begun, and yet I could feel the full scope of the case unfolding before us, as though the fog had parted to reveal the path ahead. But I knew one thing for certain: the deeper we delved into this mystery, the more dangerous it would become. Chapter 2: The Unraveling Thread. The fog that had enveloped the city outside seemed to have seeped into the very bones of the house we were investigating. It clung to the window panes, thickening the already oppressive atmosphere inside. Holmes, ever undeterred by the weight of the case, was already deep in thought, his mind working faster than any man's I had ever known. He had been inspecting the victim's body, the room, and the surrounding area with methodical precision, each movement calculated and deliberate. Meanwhile, found myself trapped between curiosity and a growing sense of unease. What do you make of it, Watson? Holmes asked, his voice breaking through the silence that had settled between us. He stood near the fireplace, his back to me, hands clasped behind him as though lost in the patterns of his own thoughts. I looked around the room once more, my gaze drawn to the still form of the victim, who lay in the same lifeless position as when we had first entered. The dagger had not been moved, still embedded in his chest, with its dark crimson stain spread across the blade. The absence of defensive wounds had continued to trouble me. The marks on the floor that Holmes had pointed out earlier still nagged. At my mind, someone had helped hold the victim still during the attack, someone who had been standing nearby. But who? I can't quite make sense of it. Holmes, I admitted, my voice betraying the frustration I was beginning to feel. The lack of a struggle is puzzling, as is the absence of any marks on the victim's hands or arms. If this was a murder, it doesn't fit the usual pattern. He couldn't have been caught by surprise if he had been restrained. Holmes didn't immediately answer, but his eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the room once more. The gaslight flickered, casting erratic shadows across his face. Indeed, Watson. And that, I believe, is the heart of the mystery. It is not the dagger that interests me most, but rather what it symbolizes. What do you mean? I asked, though I had a sinking feeling that I was about to hear something that would both unsettle and challenge my understanding of the case. Holmes turned to face me, his gaze piercing as he spoke. This dagger is not an ordinary weapon, Watson. It is a relic, one with a long and bloody history. I have seen it before, or rather, I've heard of it. The dagger is tied to a secret society, a group whose existence has remained hidden from the public eye for many years. The victim, I believe, was connected to them in some way. A secret society, I echoed, a mix of disbelief and intrigue coloring my words. And you believe the victim was a member? Not a member, but certainly an acquaintance, someone who knew too much, perhaps. Holmes's voice was laced with an edge of certainty, but the enigmatic gleam in his eyes suggested that he wasn't yet revealing the full scope of his deductions. But there's more to it than that. This society, as I understand it, has its roots in ancient rites and rituals. Their influence is vast, but it remains cloaked in secrecy. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I absorbed his words. It's a secret society, rites, rituals. These were things I had never expected to encounter in the course of my medical career, let alone in a murder investigation. Yet Holmes's confidence in his assessment left me with little doubt that he had uncovered something significant. We must find out who the victim was, Holmes continued, his voice steady. Only then will we begin to understand the motive behind his death. We know that the dagger was used on him, but we also know that it is far older than he was. This is not a random killing, Watson. This something more calculated. I nodded, though my mind was still grappling with the magnitude of the case. And what do you propose we do next? Holmes's eyes glinted, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of amusement cross his features. We visit the victim's residence. We need to gather more information, speak to those who knew him, and perhaps find a connection between him and the society I mentioned. I suspect that his death is only the beginning of something far darker. We left the house in silence, the fog still thick and unyielding, as though it had taken on a life of its own. Our carriage rolled through the dark streets, the occasional lamplight casting faint shadows that seemed to vanish before we could fully discern them. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet, his eyes scanning the streets, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. As we reached our destination, the victim's residence, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of foreboding. There was something about this house, tucked away in a quieter part of the city, that felt wrong. It was as though the very bricks of the building had been steeped in secrets for years. The house itself was nothing remarkable, though it stood on a street that seemed to be in a perpetual state of twilight, even during the day. The faint hum of the city felt distant here, as though it had forgotten this part of London entirely. As we disembarked, Holmes led the way to the front door, his footsteps sure and decisive. The door was slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for us. A manservant greeted us at the threshold, a grim look on his face. "Mr. Howard is not available for questioning, sir," the man said, his voice steady but strained. "But if you're here to inquire about the late Mr. Charles, I believe you have come to the right place." "Indeed," Holmes replied, his voice clipped. "We have come to ask about Mr. Charles Howard." The manservant nodded and stepped aside, allowing us entry. Inside, the house was dark, though the flickering light from the fire and the hearth offered some warmth. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and must, a combination of stale luxury and time-worn neglect. Holmes, always keen on details, took in the room with a single glance. Eyes immediately settled on the desk in the corner, where several documents were strewn haphazardly. "Tell me, what can you tell us about Mr. Howard?" Holmes asked, his voice taking on a tone that brooked no argument. The manservant hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his words slow and deliberate. "Mr. Howard was a man of wealth and influence, but he kept to himself mostly. He was often away, involved in business dealings that I never quite understood, but I know he was well connected, especially with certain individuals. I believe he had dealings with some rather unsavory folk." "Unsavory?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "In what way?" The manservant shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to speak further. Holmes, however, pressed on. "Who were these people, and what was Mr. Howard's involvement with them?" "I don't know the details, sir," the manservant replied, "but I overheard him talking once. Something about a secret group." He was nervous, agitated even. I didn't want to press him, but I know he was fearful of someone with a lot of power. Holmes turned to me, his eyes sharp. "A secret group," just as I suspected. I looked around the room, my thoughts whirling. If Howard had been involved with such a group, it would explain the strange events surrounding his death. But why? Would he be killed now? What had he known, and what had he uncovered? The answers, I knew, were just out of reach, but they were getting closer. The whisper of secrets, the manservant's words, lingered in the air like smoke, the notion of a secret group hanging heavily in the room. Holmes, who had been listening intently, seemed not the least bit surprised by the revelation. His eyes gleamed with a sharp intensity that I had come to recognize as his tell. He had already pieced together several fragments of the puzzle, but was deliberately withholding the majority of his deductions. "I suspect," Holmes said after a long pause, turning his gaze from the manservant to the room at large, "that Mr. Howard's connections to this group are not mere happenstance. They are deliberate and likely dangerous. But we cannot move forward without more information. I would like to see the rest of the house." The manservant, who had been hovering near the doorway, hesitated. "You'll find the rooms above. Mr. Howard's study is upstairs. He often spent time there after hours, working on matters of great importance." Holmes gave a quick nod, signaling for me to follow. We ascended the staircase, the steps creaking beneath our weight, and found ourselves in a small hallway lined with paintings of men and women dressed in finery. Each portrait seemed to gaze at us with the same stern expression, as if they, too, knew the secrets this house had kept for so long. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar, through which light flickered from within. Holmes pushed the door open without ceremony, and I followed him into the study. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single gas lamp, flickering weakly on the desk. It was a large, imposing desk-cold wood, polished by years of using. Atop it were piles of documents, letters, and assorted papers. The walls were lined with bookshelves, though the books themselves appeared rarely touched. The smell of dust and leather lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of ink and tobacco. Holmes wasted no time. He immediately began combing through the papers, his eyes skimming each one with the kind of speed and precision that only he could manage. I stood by the door, watching him in silence, a feeling of unease slowly spreading through me. It was clear that Mr. Howard's involvement in this secret group was more intricate than we had first imagined. The question remained, why was he targeted? What had he uncovered? And more importantly, what had he left behind? Holmes paused at a particular stack of papers, his fingers brushing gently over the top sheet before pulling it out. He studied it for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly, before handing it to me. "This," he said quietly, "is a letter of great importance." I took the letter from him, my hands almost trembling with anticipation. It was written in a fine, flowing script, but the content was what caught my attention. The letter was dated only a week before Mr. Howard's death and was addressed to him personally. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear and unsettling. "Mr. Howard, the time has come to act. You must join us, or the consequences will be dire. We know what you have uncovered, and it is only a matter of time before others learn of it as well. The dagger is but a symbol of what is to come. Do not refuse us, for the cost of betrayal is far greater than you can imagine. Yours, C." I felt a cold shiver run through me as I finished reading the letter. The mention of the dagger was no mere coincidence. It was the same weapon that had been used to kill Mr. Howard. But this letter suggested that his death was part of something far larger. A chain of events set into motion long before we had even stepped into this room. Holmes, I began, trying to steady my voice. This letter speaks of the dagger and of betrayal. Do you think Mr. Howard knew too much about this group? Holmes nodded, his face as impassive as ever. Indeed, Watson, Mr. Howard was not an innocent bystander in this affair. He may have been invited into this secret society, but his refusal or his decision to defy them has cost him dearly. But why was he killed now? Why not before? I asked, the question weighing heavily on my mind. Holmes's gaze turned toward the window, his eyes narrowing as he looked out at the city beyond. The answer to that lies not just in Mr. Howard's refusal to join them, but in what he knew. This group, Watson, operates in the shadows. They are powerful, and their influence stretches far beyond what the public realizes. Howard's death, however, was not merely a consequence of his refusal. It was a warning, message to others who may consider opposing them. I mulled over his words, trying to make sense of the larger picture he was painting. The mysterious group, the dagger, the secrecy, the betrayal. It was all far too intricate for my mind to fully comprehend in one sitting. But Holmes had a way of drawing connections where none seemed to exist, and I knew that he would eventually piece everything together. Just as I was about to ask another question, Holmes spoke again, his voice low and contemplative. There is more to this, Watson. This group does not simply kill to maintain control. They send a message through their actions. Howard's death was not a solitary act, okay? It is part of a larger design, one that I believe is aimed at someone else. Question is who? I frowned, not understanding. You mean to say Howard was merely a pawn in a larger game? Pawn, yes, Holmes replied, turning back to the desk. But a very important pawn. You see, Watson, Howard had something they wanted, something that could bring their entire operation to light. And they knew that, in time, he would have exposed them. His words settled over me like a heavy fog. The implications of what Holmes was saying began to unfold in my mind, but with each step forward, new questions arose. The deeper we ventured into this case, the more complex it became. We were no longer simply investigating a murder, we were unraveling a conspiracy of monumental proportions. I turned back to the room, trying to grasp something solid in the sea of uncertainty that swirled around me. The letters, the dagger, the society, all pointed to a greater mystery. But for the first time, I felt a sense of danger creeping closer, as though the shadows themselves were closing in around us. Holmes, I said, my voice almost a whisper, we have to find out who C is. This person is at the heart of everything, and they are the key to understanding what happened to Mr. Howard. Holmes did not answer immediately. He was lost in thought, his brow furrowed as he scanned the room once more. Indeed, he finally said, his voice colder than usual. But before we search for C, Watson, we must first learn who else might be involved in this secret society. There is one more place we must go before we can make any further progress, and time, I'm afraid, is running out. I looked at him, a sense of unease crawling up my spine. Oh, where do we go next? Holmes turned, his eyes locked on mine. We go to the place where the dagger was first forged. Chapter 3, The Forge of Secrets. The chill that had settled in my bones during the carriage ride to the edge of the city had only deepened when Holmes spoke those words. We go to the place where the dagger was first forged. The weight of his statement carried with it an unspoken urgency, one that I couldn't quite place but felt in my very core. What could possibly be gained by tracking down the origins of a weapon so steeped in mystery? The fog outside thickened, swirling around us as the carriage jolted over the uneven streets. Each rattle of the wheels and creak of the wood amplifying the tension in the air. Holmes, as always, was a study of calm. His eyes, which had been filled with intensity and calculation throughout our investigation, were now narrowed in deep thought. I had grown used to his enigmatic ways, but there was something about his silence now that unsettled me. "Holmes," I began, my voice cutting through the quiet of the carriage, "where exactly are we headed? What's so significant about the dagger's origins?" Holmes turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine with that sharp, knowing gaze of his. "The dagger, Watson, is more than just a symbol. It is a key to understanding not only Mr. Howard's murder, but also the very society that ordered it. The forge where it was created holds more answers than you realize." I leaned back against the carriage, the weight of his words sinking in. The dagger had been the focal point of everything from the very beginning, from its ominous display in the victim's home to the chilling letter we had discovered. But Holmes was suggesting that there was something deeper still, something buried within the very essence of the weapon's creation. "We're headed to a blacksmith's forge, I presume?" I asked, trying to keep the question casual, though a sense of foreboding was beginning to creep over me. "It's not just any forge, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice low. "The forge where this particular dagger was made is said to be hidden from the public. An old establishment that has long since fallen off the map. Its location is known only to a few select group with connections to the ancient society we're dealing with." My thoughts raced. A hidden forge. A group of individuals with the knowledge of it, tied to the shadowy society Holmes had been unraveling. It all felt like a web we were caught in, each thread leading us deeper into something far more sinister than I had anticipated. The carriage jolted once more, pulling me from my thoughts, and I saw that we had arrived. It was a small, nondescript building tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, its presence barely noticeable against the surrounding structures. The area itself felt abandoned old warehouses and dilapidated shops lined the street. There, windows boarded up or shattered. The air was thick with the smell of rust and smoke, and the ground was slick with the remnants of recent rain. Holmes paid the driver and led me down a narrow alley that seemed to disappear into the very bowels of the city. The alley was poorly lit, with only the occasional flicker of a distant street lamp to guide our path. We stopped in front of a heavy iron door set into the stone wall of one of the buildings. The door was adorned with a symbol I had seen before. Same dagger entwined with ivy, just as it had been on the seal of Mr. Howard's letter. "This is it," Holmes said quietly, his voice almost reverential. "The forge of secrets." I stared at the door, the symbol now etched into my mind. It was impossible to deny the significance of this place. This was where the weapon, the object at the heart of the murder we were investigating, had been crafted. But what could we hope to uncover here? Could we find more clues? Or were we simply walking into the lion's den? Holmes knocked once, sharply, and after a moment, the door creaked open. A large man stood in the doorway, his face hidden in shadow, but his eyes gleamed with recognition. He didn't speak, but his posture, stoic and deliberate, told me everything I needed to know. Holmes, as ever, seemed unperturbed. "We've come to ask about the dagger," Holmes said, his tone carrying the weight of an unspoken agreement. The man stepped aside, gesturing for us to enter. The forge itself was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a sprawling, cavernous space, filled with the low hum of activity. The flicker of firelight illuminated the dark corners of the room, where large anvils and tools lay scattered about, their surfaces well worn by years of use. The heat in the air was stifling, a stark contrast to the coldness outside. It was a place of purpose, of creation and destruction. Holmes walked forward, his gaze scanning the room with an almost predatory precision. The large man, who had now closed the door behind us, stood off to the side, watching us warily. I had the distinct feeling that this was not a place one wandered into without knowing exactly what one was doing. "The dagger," Holmes said, turning toward the large man, was forged here, I presume. But it's not just any weapon, is it? It has a history, a very specific purpose. The man's eyes flickered, and for a moment, I saw something behind the man, emotion I couldn't place, but one that suggested a reluctance to speak. Glanced at Holmes, then at me, before stepping forward. You don't understand the significance of that weapon, he said, his voice gravelly. It's not just a dagger, it's a message. And it was forged with intent. Holmes took a step closer, his voice low but insistent. Ordered it to be forged. Who is behind this? The man hesitated, clearly caught in a battle between loyalty and fear. After a long moment, he finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I was just the blacksmith. I don't know much, but the one who commissioned it, he's not someone you want to cross. He's a member of the group, the one who controls everything from behind the scenes. They call him C. A jolt of realization shot through me. C, I echoed, my voice almost shaking with the weight of what the man had just revealed. Holmes, however, remained calm, almost unsurprised. Where can we find him? The blacksmith's gaze dropped to the floor. I can't tell you that. It's not safe. They find out I've spoken, it'll be the last thing I ever do. Holmes stepped back, his face unreadable. I understand. But no, this of Mr. Howard's death is any indication. This man, C, is not someone who will remain hidden for long. We will find him. The blacksmith nodded grimly, his face etched with the weariness of someone who had seen too much and wished to forget it. With that, Holmes turned on his heel, and I followed him out of the forge. The cool night air hit me like a wave, but the unease I felt remained, lingering in the back of my mind. The pieces were coming together, but the puzzle was still far from solved. As we made our way back to the carriage, I couldn't help but wonder just how far this web of secrets would stretch and what price we would pay for uncovering its heart. The web tightens. The air felt heavier as Holmes and I left the forge, our steps echoing faintly against the darkened streets. The firelight from within had barely penetrated the deep shadows of the night, and the cool mist from the city's pervasive fog seemed to cling to us as we made our way back toward the carriage. The street, devoid of life, appeared to stretch endlessly into the night, as though the fog itself were swallowing up any traces of the world beyond. My thoughts, however, remained fixed on the blacksmith's cryptic words. They call him C. The revelation had shifted the focus of our investigation in an unexpected direction. We had learned a great deal from the blacksmith, but still, the question remained, who was C, and why did he command such power over this shadowy society? Holmes, I ventured, breaking the uneasy silence between us, the blacksmith. He spoke of C as though he were some shadowy figure behind the scenes, but do you have any idea who this person truly is? Holmes glanced at me, his expression unreadable. Indeed, Watson. I have a few theories, though none are certain as of yet. But one thing is clear. C is not simply a man of wealth or influence. He is someone far more dangerous, someone whose reach extends into the very heart of London's underbelly. He commands a network that, for all intents and purposes, operates outside the law and outside of society's conventions. But how could such a person remain hidden for so long? I pressed, my mind racing with possibilities. Surely, someone would have noticed by now, or at least suspected something. Holmes's lips curled into a thin, knowing smile. That, Watson, is exactly the point. Those who work in the shadows are masters of concealment. They thrive on secrecy and operate in such a manner that even the most careful observer would be unable to detect their influence until it is too late. Mr. Howard, I believe, learned of C's existence and attempted to expose him. That, I suspect, is why he was killed. The carriage creaked as it jolted over the cobblestone streets, its wheels squeaking in protest as we headed toward our next destination. Holmes's words lingered in my mind, but I felt the growing sense of unease began to tighten its grip around me. Every step we took brought us closer to the heart of something darker than either of us could have anticipated. The next morning, we found ourselves in a district of London that I had only heard whispers of, an area near the docks, where the scent of salt water mixed with the more pungent odors of industry. The streets here were narrow, and the buildings, though once grand, now looked as though they had been ravaged by time and neglect. It was a place where secrets were born and buried, and where powerful men like C could move unseen among the masses. Holmes, of course, had his eyes set on a particular location. We had arrived at a nondescript building on the edge of the district of building that, at first glance, appeared to be nothing more than a run-of-the-mill warehouse. Yet, according to Holmes, it was here that we would find the next piece of the puzzle. I, of course, was intrigued, but uncertain of what we might uncover. This, Holmes explained as we stood outside the building, is a place where those who wish to remain hidden come to do business. It is a meeting place, though not one that can be found on any official records. I glanced at the structure, my gaze scanning its windowless exterior. And what exactly are we hoping to find here, Holmes? A connection, Holmes replied, his voice as steady as ever. It is not merely coincidence that we find ourselves in this district. Answer to the mystery of sea lies somewhere within this building, and if we are fortunate, we will uncover more about Mr. Howard's connection to this society. We approached the building cautiously, making our way through the narrow alley that led to the rear entrance. The door, though unmarked, seemed unusually well kept, a stark contrast to the dilapidation of the surrounding area. Holmes knocked twice, sharply, and after a moment, a small panel in the door slid open. A pair of eyes peered through the crack. "We seek answers," Holmes said succinctly, his voice clear but not forceful. "We wish to speak with your employer." There was a pause before the door was slowly unlocked, and we were allowed inside. We stepped into a dimly lit hallway, the air heavy with the scent of tobacco and something else, something that carried a faint metallic undertone. As we made our way deeper into the building, I couldn't help but feel that we were entering the heart of something sinister. Hallway opened into a large, open space and industrial room filled with stacks of crates, barrels, and various odds and ends. There was little sign of human activity, yet the air felt thick with unspoken tension. Holmes's eyes darted around the room as he took in every detail, his sharp mind, no doubt, already at work. "We'll find him soon enough," Holmes muttered, under his breath, as though speaking more to himself than to me. I nodded, but a gnawing sensation had taken root in my stomach. Every instinct screamed that we were not alone in this place, that we were being watched by eyes hidden in the shadows. It was an eerie feeling, one I had grown all too familiar with during our investigations into London's criminal underworld. As we ventured further into the building, we were suddenly confronted by a man, a tall, imposing figure who stepped out from behind a stack of crates. His eyes were cold, and there was an unmistakable air of authority about him. He had the look of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed, someone who commanded the respect of those around him. "Holmes," the man said, his voice low and gravelly, as though he had been expecting us. "I've heard much about you." Holmes did not flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes unwavering as he met the man's gaze. "And I suppose you are the one who has been pulling the strings behind all of this." The man's lips curled into a smile, but it was not one of friendliness. "I have no intention of pulling any strings, Mr. Holmes. I merely see to it that the right people gets what they deserve." He paused, as though sizing Holmes up. "You are, however, persistent. I'll give you that." "Persistence," Holmes said coolly, "is often rewarded in my line of work." "Okay." The man's smile faded, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something fear perhaps. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "We both know you're not here by coincidence, Holmes," the man said. "So let me offer you a piece of advice. Turn back now. You are meddling in matters that are far beyond your control." Holmes took a step forward, his voice steady and unwavering. "I don't intend to turn back. Not until I've uncovered the truth about C and about the role this society has played in Mr. Howard's death." The man's expression hardened. "Then you are already too late. The truth has already been decided." Silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken threats. I could sense the danger that hung in the air, the tension of a confrontation that was inevitable. We were nearing the heart of this shadowy world, and I had no doubt that we would soon learn far more than we had bargained for. Chapter 4. The Gathering. Storm. The man's cold, calculating expression did little to ease the rising tension in the room. His presence alone seemed to suffocate the air, as though we had trespassed into a domain far more dangerous than we had realized. His posture, the way his hands rested casually by his sides, suggested an arrogance that belied the gravity of the situation. Yet there was something else in his gaze, a flicker of wariness, as though we had struck closer to the truth than he had anticipated. Holmes, unperturbed by the man's demeanor, stood perfectly still, his eyes locked onto the figure before us. "I must admit," Holmes said calmly, "you are as elusive as you are confident. Okay, but you are also mistaken if you believe that threats will deter us from uncovering the truth." The man's lips curled into a tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "And what, exactly, is this truth you seek, Mr. Holmes?" "It's the truth of a man who is nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. Or perhaps the truth of an ancient society that has survived in the shadows for far longer than you can imagine." Holmes's gaze never wavered, his voice steady as he responded. "I am not interested in pawns or their games, Mr. Carter. I am interested in the men who control them, okay? The ones who operate in the dark and think they can escape the light of truth. And you, Mr. Carter, are one of those men." At the mention of his name, the man's expression flickered for a fraction of a second, just enough to catch my attention. Carter, a name I hadn't heard before, but now seemed central to our investigation. He was part of the puzzle, and Holmes had identified him as someone who likely held the key to uncovering C and the secret society behind Mr. Howard's murder. Carter's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as if preparing for a confrontation. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Holmes. There are forces at play here that are far beyond your understanding. The world you know is not the world that exists in the shadows. And the people who operate in these shadows do not take kindly to intruders." Holmes took a step forward, his voice as unwavering as ever. "I understand more than you think, Carter. I've seen the lengths people will go to in order to protect their secrets. And I've seen the destruction that follows when they think they are untouchable." Carter's smile faded entirely, replaced by a look of barely contained anger. "You're already too far in, Meyer. There's no turning back now." There was a brief pause, thick with unspoken words. I could feel the atmosphere in the room growing heavier, as though something unseen was about to break. I stepped forward cautiously, trying to keep the peace. "Mr. Carter, we're not here to cause harm. We're simply looking for answers. You know as well as I do that this web is far more complicated than a simple murder. Mr. Howard was a man of influence, and his death has set in motion something far larger than he likely ever realized. We need to know who is truly behind it." Carter's eyes flickered again, but he didn't respond. His silence spoke volumes. The threat was clear. He was unwilling to provide any more information. Holmes, however, was far from discouraged. He had a way of pressing forward, even in the face of such resistance. His voice remained steady, yet it carried the weight of a man who had already decided on his course of action. I understand you are loyal to the sea, but loyalty to a criminal enterprise will not save you when the truth comes to light. You are merely a pawn in a much larger game, and I'm certain that the people you serve are no more benevolent than they appear. This is your opportunity to make a choice: continue down this path of secrecy, or help us expose the corruption that has taken hold of this city. For a long moment, Carter said nothing. The air felt thick, charged with tension. Then, to my surprise, he finally spoke. His voice was low, almost reluctant, as though he had made a decision that he couldn't take back. "There's nothing you can do," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't know what you're up against. If you want to find C, you'll have to dig deeper than this. You'll have to uncover the very roots of the society you're chasing. And once you do, you'll realize the cost of your inquiry. There are things in this world, people who are beyond your reach, beyond the law. You won't be able to stop them. You'll never even see them coming." The finality in his words struck me like a blow, but I could see that Holmes remained unshaken. He wasn't intimidated, nor was he dissuaded by the warning. If anything, I sensed that Carter's words had only deepened Holmes's resolve. "Tell me," Holmes said, his voice quieter now. "Who is C? Where can we find him? What is the connection between the murder of Mr. Howard and the society you serve?" Carter's face tightened, but his lips remained sealed. It was clear that he was wrestling with some internal conflict, but he wasn't ready to give up any more information. Holmes, however, was patient. He had a way of allowing silence to stretch, of making those around him feel as though every passing second was an eternity. Finally, Carter spoke again, his voice tinged with a trace of something: resignation, perhaps, or fear. "You want the truth? The truth is that this society is not some passing fancy, some hidden group operating in the fringes. They have existed for centuries, and their power runs deep. They are connected to the very foundation of this city. And, see, he is a man you will never find, because he is everywhere and nowhere. He is the embodiment of everything this city hides, everything it pretends not to be." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "So, C is a figurehead, a phantom." Carter shook his head. "No, C is real. But he is not one man. He is many, things shifting, elusive. The man you seek is merely a vessel. And in the end, you will understand that the hunt for him is a fool's errand. The truth you seek will destroy you, Mr. Holmes. You are already in too deep." Holmes stood still. For a moment, his gaze fixed on Carter. I could sense the wheels turning in his mind, the many connections coming together, but he said nothing further. Instead, he turned to leave, signaling for me to follow. Outside the building, the fog seemed denser than before, as though it had thickened in response to our conversation. The streets, too, seemed quieter, as if holding their breath. I could feel the weight of Carter's words pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn deeper into something far more dangerous than we had anticipated. Holmes remained as calm as ever, but I could see the determination in his eyes. "We are on the right path, Watson," he said, his voice steady. "But it is clear that this mystery runs deeper than we could have imagined. The pieces are scattered, but they will come together. And when they do, we will uncover not only the truth about Mr. Howard's death, but the true nature of this secret society." The fog parted briefly as we stepped back onto the main road, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. We had uncovered a trail, but it was clear that the answers we sought would come at a steep price. The storm was gathering, and we were standing at its center. Tenuous thread. The carriage ride back to Baker Street felt longer than it had any right to. The weight of Carter's words continued to press down on me, and though Holmes remained outwardly calm, I could tell that the mystery had only deepened for him as well. As the carriage rattled over the cobblestones, the fog outside thickened. and I couldn't shake the sense that the entire city was holding its breath. The deeper we dug into this case, the more elusive the answers became. Holmes sat across from me, his expression unreadable as he stared out the window. It was a rare moment of silence. For him, his mind always worked in overdrive, piecing together the fragments of a case in a way that no ordinary person could. But tonight, even he seemed to be deep in thought. After what felt like an eternity, the carriage finally arrived at Baker Street, and we stepped out into the cool evening air. Holmes wasted no time in heading upstairs to his study, and I followed suit, feeling the familiar tension of anticipation build in my chest. We had learned much from Carter Farm, more than I had expected, but there was still so much left unanswered. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that our next steps were crucial. As we entered Holmes's study, he immediately began to pace, his mind clearly already shifting into the next phase of the investigation. He moved with purpose, almost as if trying to outrun his thoughts. Ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder than usual, each tick a reminder that time was slipping away. I took a seat by the fireplace, watching Holmes as he moved around the room. He stopped near his desk, his eyes scanning the various piles of notes and papers that lay scattered across it. After a moment, he turned to me, his face sharp with determination. "Watson," he said, his voice steady, "we have reached a critical point in this investigation." Carter's words were not to be taken lightly. It is clear that the society we are dealing with is far more dangerous and far-reaching than we ever anticipated. But we are closer than ever to unraveling the truth. I leaned forward, my mind racing with possibilities. What about C. Holmes? What did he mean when he said that C is everywhere and nowhere? How can we hope to find a man who is both a figurehead and a phantom? Holmes's eyes gleamed, the spark of realization flickering in them. Watson is the key to everything. C is not a single individual. He is a symbol, an embodiment of the society itself. C represents the power and control this group wields over the city, a force that operates in the shadows, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. But if C is a symbol, I asked, how do we even begin to find him, or them? Holmes paused, turning toward the window. The fog outside had thickened, and the dim street lamp cast long shadows against the walls. We must go to the source, Watson. To understand this society, we must understand its roots. And to do that, we must learn about its origins, who founded it, when it was established, and what its true purpose is. Only then will we begin to understand why Mr. Howard was targeted and how C fits into all of this. I could see the gears turning in Holmes's mind, and though I was no less perplexed by the mystery than before, I knew that we were heading in the right direction. Holmes's ability to see connections where others could not had never been more vital. But we had reached a point where the stakes were higher than ever, and the path forward was anything but clear. Holmes continued to pace, his brow furrowed in concentration. The next step, Watson, is to trace the origins of this society. We must find the first members of the founders, if you will, learn how they became so powerful. This will lead us to C, but we must be cautious. The more we uncover, the more dangerous this investigation will become. We are no longer dealing with simple murder. We are dealing with an organization that has existed for centuries. I stood, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. So, we need to dig deeper into the history of this society. Then, do we have any leads on where to begin? Holmes turned to me, his face hardening with determination. Yes, we begin with Mr. Howard's personal history. He may have been the victim in this case, but he also holds the key to understanding how this society operates. We will find out who he was in contact with, who he was investigating, and what he uncovered about this group. I nodded, my mind already shifting to the practicalities of the investigation. I'll start by reviewing Mr. Howard's personal records, his letters, his diaries, anything that might give us a clearer picture of his connections. Perhaps there's something hidden in his past that could lead us to the origins of this group. Holmes gave a sharp nod. That is a good place to start, Watson. But we must also consider the possibility that Mr. Howard was not the only one involved in this web. There may be other people who had suspicions about the society and who may have been silenced before they could expose the truth. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle in as I thought about the ramifications of what we were uncovering. This was no longer just about solving a murder. We were uncovering a vast and dangerous conspiracy that reached into the heart of London's power structures. We were chasing a phantom, but we had no idea how far the shadows stretched. As Holmes returned to his desk, his fingers brushing over the various pieces of evidence, I began to feel the weight of the case pressing down on me. This was a moment of reckoning. The truth was out there, but it was hidden behind layers of secrecy, power, and corruption. We were closing in, but the closer we came, the more perilous the journey became. Holmes, as always, was one step ahead. He had already made the connections, had already begun to trace the threads that would ultimately lead us to the heart of the conspiracy. But I knew that whatever we uncovered next would change everything, and the cost of that knowledge would be far greater than we could imagine. Watson, Holmes said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of urgency, we must prepare ourselves for what lies ahead. The answers we seek are within our reach, but they will not come without a price. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the edge of something monumental, something that would irrevocably change our understanding of the world we thought we knew. Chapter 5. Unveiling the Past. The following days were a blur of activity. But no matter how much information I sifted through, no matter how many documents I examined, the answers we sought remained tantalizingly out of reach. Holmes's determination had only deepened, but I could see the strain beginning to show in his eyes. We were moving closer, but each step forward seemed to reveal more questions than answers. Holmes had directed me to scour Mr. Howard's personal records, letters, his journals, anything that might hint at the connections he had made in his final days. I had spent hours combing through the papers, finding little pieces of a man who had clearly been deeply involved in something far more significant than his public persona suggested. Each document was a whisper of a story half told, and I could feel that we were on the edge of uncovering something monumental. But what? I sat at Holmes's desk late one evening, surrounded by a mountain of Mr. Howard's personal belongings. There were no grand revelations, yet just scraps of correspondence and notes that seemed disconnected from one another. One letter caught my eye. It was unmarked, folded with an air of secrecy, and written in a hand that was unfamiliar to me. The letter was dated nearly a year before his death. I unfolded it carefully, scanning the elegant script. Mr. Howard, I trust that you have come to see the necessity of our arrangement. We have both made our choices, and while I understand the burden this places upon you, I must remind you of the consequences of failure. This will not be the last time we meet. Remember that you are not alone in this matter. Yours, C. The letter was brief, cryptic, and yet it sent a chill down my spine. C. The very same letter we had heard about from the blacksmith. But this time, it wasn't just a vague reference. It was a confirmation. Mr. Howard had been involved with C, and had been drawn into the society in a manner that suggested a deeper connection. His death was no accident. It was a result of something far more calculated. Holmes had been right all along. We had to go deeper, not just into the mystery of the murder, but into the very heart of this society. This letter, which had seemed so insignificant at first glance, was the breakthrough we needed. I immediately took the letter to Holmes, who had been reviewing the maps of London's old districts. tracing any historical connections that might lead us to the origins of this elusive society. The moment he saw the letter, he looked up at me, his eyes sharp with recognition. "This," he said slowly, taking the letter from my hand, "confirms what I suspected. Mr. Howard was not just an innocent bystander. He had become entangled with them, perhaps even unknowingly. But now we know that his involvement went far deeper than we had originally thought." I sat back in my chair, the weight of the discovery settling over me. So, C knew of Mr. Howard before his death. But what does it mean? What does he want with him? Or rather, with the information Mr. Howard uncovered? Holmes placed the letter carefully on the desk, his fingers lightly tracing the words. "It's clear that C is not someone who acts recklessly. This letter, though brief, is a subtle reminder of power. This is not a warning to Mr. Howard. It is a calculated move. They wanted him to know that they were watching, that they knew the moment he started to uncover their secrets. The society's reach is vast, Watson, and now we are learning the true extent of it." I leaned forward, my mind racing. "But this doesn't tell us enough. What exactly did Mr. Howard learn, and why was he killed?" Holmes paused, considering the question carefully. "The answer to that question, Watson, lies not in what Mr. Howard learned, but in what he was about to reveal. There is something about this society, something so powerful that Mr. Howard's death was likely the only way to prevent its exposure." I stood up, pacing the room, frustration building. But we're no closer to uncovering the full picture. We have a name C, but no way of knowing who this person truly is. All we have are shadows. Holmes's eyes flicked toward the window, where the dim glow of the street lamp outside barely illuminated the thick fog that had rolled in once more. He was silent for a moment before speaking. "Perhaps it is time to follow another lead. Mr. Howard's connections are not the only piece of this puzzle. We must turn our attention to the places he frequented, places where this society may have left its mark." The thought hit me with sudden clarity. "You mean the places Mr. Howard visited in his final days, his last meetings, his appointments?" Holmes nodded. "Exactly. The answer may lie in the people he spoke with, the places he went to gather information, or even the way he tried to warn others. We must retrace his steps and see where he was most active in the days before his death." I agreed, though the task felt increasingly perilous. Every lead seemed to pull us deeper into a maze of hidden agendas and dangerous allegiances. But we had no choice. We were too close to turn back now. The next morning, Holmes and I set out to retrace Mr. Howard's steps, his final meetings, the contacts he had been in touch with, and the locations he had visited had all been meticulously documented. With these records in hand, we began our search in earnest. We started at an old, almost forgotten bookshop near the edge of the city, a place where Mr. Howard had reportedly spent hours poring over rare texts in the days leading up to his death. The shop was small, its shelves crammed with dusty volumes that had long since been out of print. As we entered, the musty scent of aging paper and leather filled the air, and a bell rang softly above the door. A proprietor, a thin man with a nervous demeanor, looked up from behind the counter. Holmes wasted no time looking for any records of Mr. Charles Howard's visits here, Holmes said, his voice sharp with authority. Anything that might indicate who he was meeting or what he was researching. The man's eyes flickered nervously, but he didn't hesitate. "Mr. Howard? Yes, he came here often. He was always asking about obscure texts, books on secret societies, ancient rituals, strange things. He left a few days before before the incident." His voice trailed off, and I noticed a faint tremor in his hands. Holmes leaned in, his tone calm but insistent. "Did he ever mention anything about the people he was meeting or the books he was looking for?" The man swallowed his eyes, darting to the back of the shop as though looking for an escape. He was researching something. Something big. He asked for a particular book, The Hidden Rites of the Forgotten Kings, but I told him it was out of print. I don't know who he was planning to meet, but he said he had some leads. That was the last time I saw him. Holmes's expression darkened, and he turned to me, his voice low. The books he was interested in, they are more than just obscure texts. They are records of the very society we've been tracking. This is no coincidence. I nodded grimly. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place. We were one step closer to uncovering the truth, and one step closer to confronting whatever darkness lay at the heart of this conspiracy. Echoes of the past, the dusty bookshop had yielded more than I had anticipated. The mention of the hidden rites of the Forgotten Kings confirmed much of what we had already suspected. Mr. Howard's investigation into the secret society was far deeper than a mere chance encounter. His research was not just a personal curiosity, but something far more dangerous. This was no casual pursuit. He had been drawn into something far darker, something that had the potential to unravel the very fabric of the city. Holmes had been quiet ever since our departure from the bookshop, his mind clearly racing with the implications of what we had learned. I, on the other hand, found myself struggling to process the gravity of the situation. The deeper we ventured into this mystery, the more I realized how much was at stake. Every piece of the puzzle we uncovered seemed to open new doors, each leading us further into the labyrinth of secrets that Mr. Howard had unwittingly become a part of. As the carriage carried us back to Baker Street, I couldn't help but feel that we were being watched, though I couldn't say why. The streets of London, despite their familiarity, had taken on an ominous air. The fog had thickened once more, as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I glanced at Holmes, but he was lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. "We need to find that book," Holmes finally said, his voice breaking the silence. "The one Mr. Howard was looking for. If we can locate it, we may be able to uncover the society's true origins. That is the key to understanding their power and perhaps even to exposing C." I nodded, though I was still struggling to make sense of everything. But where do we even begin to look? The bookshop owner mentioned that it was out of print. It could be nearly impossible to find. Holmes turned to me, his expression as focused as ever. "Nothing is impossible, Watson. Okay? We have the resources to find it. We need to track down any copies that may be hidden away, anyone who might have knowledge of it." Mr. Howard was onto something much bigger than he knew. And now we have the chance to finish what he started. The determination in Holmes's voice was palpable. Despite the danger that seemed to lurk around every corner, I knew that we were nearing the end of our investigation, even if it was still obscured in shadow. We needed that book. It was our only link to uncovering the full scope of this secret society and to understanding why Mr. Howard had been silenced. Back at Baker Street, we wasted no time in setting our plans into motion. Holmes immediately began writing letters to various institutions, reaching out to collectors, scholars, and rare booksellers who might have any information on the hidden rites of the Forgotten Kings. It was a tedious task, but Holmes's persistence was unmatched, and I knew that if anyone could find a needle in a haystack, it was him. In the meantime, I continued to sift through Mr. Howard's records. The more I reviewed his correspondence, the more I saw the picture becoming clearer. Mr. Howard had not been investigating a single individual or a single event. He had been investigating a network, vast web of influence that stretched back centuries. And at the center of it all was this elusive society, a group so secretive that they had managed to bury their roots deep within the very institutions of London. But the more I read, the more I realized that Mr. Howard's investigation had uncovered something far more dangerous than he had likely ever imagined. This was no mere conspiracy. This was a force that had shaped the city in ways that were only now beginning to come to light. The book he had sought was not just a historical record. It was a key to understanding the origins of this society and its influence over the city's elite. As I was reviewing another batch of letters, one in particular caught my attention. It was a letter from a man named Richard Stokes, a renowned historian and a former professor at one of London's most prestigious universities. The letter was dated just a week before Mr. Howard's death, and it was clear from the tone that Stokes had been deeply concerned about the direction Howard's investigation had taken. "Mr. Howard, I urge you to reconsider the course of action you have undertaken. The path you are following is fraught with danger, and there are forces at play here that I cannot, in good conscience, allow you to confront alone. You are digging into something far darker than you realize, and I fear that your pursuit of the truth will lead to a reckoning that none of us are prepared for. I will not be held accountable for what may happen next. Richard Stokes." The letter was chilling. Stokes's warning was as clear as it was ominous. Whatever Mr. Howard had uncovered, it was far more dangerous than even Stokes was willing to confront. I showed the letter to Holmes, who studied it with great interest. "This," Holmes said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of urgency, "confirms what we suspected. Mr. Howard had grown too close to the truth. His death was no accident. It was the result of a deliberate action to silence him." But Richard Stokes's letter is a critical piece of the puzzle. He knew something, okay? He might even be a key to understanding what Mr. Howard was uncovering. Holmes stood, his expression sharpening with focus. "We need to find Richard Stokes. He may hold the final answers. We need to uncover the full scope of this society. But be warned, Watson Stokes is likely to be just as elusive as C. If he knew what Howard was investigating, then he, too, may be in danger." I nodded, a sense of unease settling in my chest. If Stokes was as fearful of this society as his letter suggested, then finding him would not be easy. But I also knew that this was the only lead we had left, and it was one that we could not afford to ignore. The search for Richard Stokes took us into London's most prestigious academic circles, but as expected, he was elusive. We learned that he had disappeared shortly after his correspondence with Mr. Howard, and no one seemed to know where he had gone. However, we did manage to uncover a small leader, former colleague of Stokes's, who might have known more about his recent activities. We arranged to meet with this colleague, a Professor Jonathan Wilkes, who had taught alongside Stokes for many years. He was based at a quiet university on the outskirts of London, far from the bustle of the city center. We arrived at his office late in the afternoon, the fading light casting long shadows across the university's ivy-clad buildings. The professor was waiting for us, sitting behind a cluttered desk stacked high with books and papers. "You are looking for Richard Stokes, I presume?" Wilkes asked without preamble, his voice hoarse, as though he had been expecting us. "I'm afraid you're too late. Stokes vanished some time ago. But I can tell you this, he wasn't the same after he began his research into the rites. It consumed him." I leaned forward, the urgency in Wilkes's voice making my pulse quicken. "What do you mean? What did he discover?" Wilkes hesitated, then lowered his voice. "He discovered that the society Mr. Howard was investigating wasn't just historical. They're still active, still pulling strings in this city. And they've been doing so for centuries. That is why Stokes disappeared. And that is why you should be careful." He paused, his gaze flickering toward the door, as though checking for eavesdroppers. "This society will stop at nothing to protect their secrets." Chapter 6. The Price of Knowledge. Professor Wilkes's words hung in the air like a dense fog, thick with the weight of what he had just revealed. The very notion that the secret society Mr. Howard had been investigating was not merely a relic of the past, but an active, present force within the city, sent a shiver down my spine. The society had managed to operate under the radar for so long, pulling strings in the shadows, Then how deeply had it penetrated the very fabric of London's society? And, more importantly, how far were they willing to go to protect their secrets? Wilkes's trembling hands pushed a stack of papers aside, as if he couldn't bear to look at them any longer. Stokes didn't just vanish, he continued, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. He left behind a series of notes, fragments, really. They were incomplete, disjointed, tasks, but he was afraid. Whatever he found, he knew it was bigger than anything he could handle. I leaned forward, eager to hear more. What did he find, Professor? What did he uncover that frightened him so much? Wilkes hesitated, clearly unsure of how much he should reveal. Finally, he sighed and stood up, pacing restlessly across the small office. Stokes believed that the society wasn't just about controlling power or wealth, it was about preserving it. They had been around long before London's elite, long before the city's foundations were even laid. A causes runs deeper than we can imagine. He thought they were preparing something that would change the course of history, okay? And they would stop at nothing to ensure it happened. Preparing something, I echoed, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. What exactly were they preparing for? I don't know, Wilkes replied, stopping in front of a bookshelf as if searching for something. But Stokes's notes mentioned something about an ancient ritual, an event that would unite their power across time and space. It was all very vague, but he was convinced it was imminent. I exchanged a glance with Holmes, who had remained unusually quiet up until this point. His eyes were fixed on Wilkes, but they seemed distant, as if processing 1,000 thoughts at once. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice measured but intense. This ritual, did Stokes believe it was linked to the society's control over the city? Holmes asked, his gaze unwavering. Absolutely, Wilkes responded without hesitation. Stokes believed that the society had a hand in every major event in London's history: wars, revolutions, even economic booms and crashes. They were always present, always influencing, always shaping the world from the shadows. And their power was not just social or financial, it was spiritual. That's what terrified Stokes the most. He thought they had uncovered something ancient, something beyond our understanding. Holmes stood up, his movements deliberate. And this ritual doesn't have any connection to the book Mr. Howard was searching for. Wilkes seemed to stiffen at the question, his face paling. It's possible. Stokes thought that the book, The Hidden Rites of the Forgotten Kings, held the final piece of the puzzle. He believed it contained the knowledge they had been seeking for centuries. Knowledge that would grant them power over life and death itself. The room seemed to close in around me as I absorbed Wilkes's words. Knowledge that could grant power over life and death. What kind of ritual had Mr. Howard and Stokes uncovered? And what had Mr. Howard learned before he was silenced? Holmes, ever the tactician, was already considering the next steps. Professor, do you have any idea where Stokes might have gone? Any leads on his whereabouts? Wilkes shook his head, his eyes filled with regret. No, I don't. He had become increasingly paranoid before he disappeared. He believed someone was watching him, someone connected to the society. He left without warning, taking only his most recent notes. I've been trying to piece together what he left behind, but without him, I'm not sure what to make of it. Where were these notes stored? Holmes pressed, his voice sharper now. Wilkes hesitated, then reluctantly went to a small, locked drawer in his desk. He retrieved a bundle of tattered papers, each one covered in hastily scrawled notes and references. This is all that's left, he said quietly, handing the bundle to Holmes. Holmes accepted the papers with a quiet nod, scanning the contents with his usual efficiency. As he read, I watched his face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. There was a shift in his demeanor, a subtle tightening of his jaw, a flicker of understanding behind his eyes. These notes, Holmes murmured, after a long pause, contain references to several locations, places of historical significance to the society. These are not just random sites, Watson. They are key to understanding how the society operates and what they intend to achieve with this ritual. I stood up, my pulse quickening. What do you mean? Where are these places? Are they here? In London. Holmes's gaze met mine, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of unease in his eyes. Yes, Watson. They are all here in London, and I believe the ritual is set to take place at one of these locations. But what I don't yet understand is how they intend to carry it out, what the true cost will be. Wilkes's voice interrupted us, his tone desperate. You don't understand what you're getting into. This society, this cult, they've been manipulating history for centuries. If you continue this investigation, you'll find yourselves in the same position Stokes was. Do you really think you can expose them and survive? Holmes's gaze hardened, his voice cold. I have no intention of backing down now, Professor, but I do appreciate your warning. The truth is already in motion, and it cannot be stopped. I looked at Holmes, still unsure of what we were about to face. The deeper we dug, the more dangerous the path became. But we couldn't stop now, not when the answers were so close. Whatever this society was preparing, whatever ritual they intended to complete, we had to stop it before it was too late. As we left Wilkes's office, I could feel the weight of the case pressing down on me. The mystery had shifted from a simple investigation into a fight against an unseen enemy, one that had existed far longer than we could have imagined. We were now in a race against time, with the society's ritual looming on the horizon. We must act quickly, Holmes said, breaking the silence. The ritual is imminent, and we cannot afford to waste any more time. We need to find out where it will take place and stop it before it's too late. His words rang in my ears, a stark reminder of the stakes. But as I followed Holmes through the streets of London, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into a trap. The society had been operating in the shadows for centuries, and we had no idea how far they would go to protect their secrets. The storm was closing in, and I wasn't sure we would survive it. The hidden path, the streets of London, felt colder than usual as Holmes and I made our way toward our next destination. The deeper we ventured into the web of secrecy surrounding the society, the more uneasy I became. The ritual, the ancient rites, and the shadowy figures behind it all loomed over us like a dark cloud, threatening to swallow us whole. We had uncovered a wealth of information, but it seemed as though every answer we found only led to more questions. The closer we came to the truth, the more dangerous the path became. Holmes, as always, remained calm, his sharp mind already moving forward, formulating new strategies. He had barely spoken since our conversation with Professor Wilkes, but I could sense that he was thinking through the puzzle with his usual intensity. I, on the other hand, found myself consumed with a sense of urgency. We had no idea what kind of power this society wielded, nor how far their influence reached. But if what we had uncovered was true, then we were dealing with forces beyond anything I had ever imagined. We stopped at a quiet, unassuming tavern near the edge of the city, a place Holmes had frequented in the past for gathering information. It was the kind of establishment that didn't draw attention. It's kind that hid in plain sight, where information could be traded without drawing too much suspicion. Holmes had his methods, and he trusted this place for a reason. As we entered, the air was thick with the smell of aged wood and pipe smoke. The low murmur of conversation filled the space, but no one paid us any particular attention. As Holmes led me to a corner where we sat down at a small table, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. We need to find the locations mentioned in Stokes's notes, Holmes said quietly, his eyes scanning the room. I believe the ritual will take place in one of them, but we need to confirm which one. There may be someone here who can help us. I nodded, my mind still reeling from the implications of our discoveries. The society had been manipulating events for centuries, shaping the course of history in ways we couldn't fully comprehend. And now, we were racing against time to prevent them from completing their ritual that could change everything. Holmes's gaze flicked to the bartender, a stout man with a weathered face and a knowing look in his eyes. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice low but clear. We're looking for someone with knowledge of the old city, the places where the society may have left its mark. You've heard of such things, I'm sure. The bartender paused, wiping a glass with a rag before answering. You're not the first to ask about those places, Mr. Holmes, he said, his voice low and guarded. There's talk of a hidden path through the city, a forgotten route, known only to a few. It leads to places that are older than anything the city's builders could have imagined, but it's not something that's spoken of lightly. People who search for it often disappear. Holmes's eyes narrowed, his interest piqued. And what do you know of this path? Where does it lead? The bartender looked over his shoulder, ensuring no one was listening. I don't know much, but I've heard stories. Some say it's an underground network built long ago to protect the city's secrets. Others claim it leads to a hidden sanctuary somewhere the society holds meetings. It's a place where the ritual could take place. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. Where can we find this path? The bartender shook his head. I can't say for sure. It's not something you just stumble upon, but there's an old map that shows the route, though it's locked away in a private collection. You'd need to find someone who knows, the right people to get it. Holmes's expression hardened. Do you know where this map is kept? The bartender hesitated. I do, but it's not something I can just hand over. You'd need to speak with Marcus. He's the one who has access to it, but he's not the sort of man you'd want to cross. Where can we find him? Holmes pressed, his voice steady. The bartender's gaze shifted nervously. Marcus is not someone who likes to be found, but I've seen him at the old docks near the warehouses by the river. You'll know him by his eyes cold, like a man who's seen things he can never forget. But be warned, Marcus is not someone to be trusted. If you want the map, you'll have to play his game. Holmes stood up, his decision made. Thank you for your help. We'll find Marcus. As we left the tavern, the weight of our next move settled over me. We were no longer just investigating a murder or unraveling a conspiracy. We were now involved in something far deeper, something that would require every ounce of our skill and determination. But I couldn't help but wonder what kind of game Marcus would play, and what price we would have to pay for the map that could lead us to the hidden path. The docks were colder than I had expected, the wind whipping off the river and carrying with it the faint smell of salt water and decay. The streets were empty, save for a few sailors loading crates onto ships that creaked in the harbor. Holmes led the way, his every movement purposeful, as though he had already mapped out every step in his mind. I followed closely, my thoughts consumed with the task ahead. We reached a small, weathered building near the water's edge, its windows boarded up and its door half open. It was the kind of place that seemed to have been abandoned long ago, though the faint flicker of a lantern inside suggested otherwise. Holmes motioned for me to stay back as he approached the door and knocked twice, sharp and deliberate. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a man whose eyes matched the bartender's description perfectly. He was tall and gaunt, with a sharp jawline and a cold, calculating gaze. His eyes were unsettling, as though they had seen far too much for a man of his age. He didn't speak immediately, but he studied Holmes and me with a look that seemed to pierce right through us. Marcus, Holmes asked, his tone polite but firm. The man nodded, his expression never changing. You're looking for something? I'm the one who can help you find it. But nothing comes free, Mr. Holmes. Holmes didn't flinch. I'm not interested in games. We need the map. Marcus smiled, but it was a smile that held no warmth. Oh, I'm sure you do, okay? But nothing is ever as simple as you'd like it to be. You'll have to prove yourself first. Holmes's eyes flickered with barely concealed impatience. We don't have time for games, Marcus. We need the map now. Marcus stepped aside, allowing us entry. You'll get it. But first, you'll have to play by my rules. As we stepped into the dimly lit room, God, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to enter a game where the stakes were higher than we could ever imagine. The final pieces of this dangerous puzzle were within our reach, but I knew that the path forward would not be without its cost. Chapter 7. The game begins. The room Marcus led us into was dimly lit, the faint flicker of lantern light casting long, uneven shadows across the bare stone walls. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and mildew, as though the place hadn't seen much use in years. The only furnishings were a few rickety chairs and a wooden table covered with various odds and ends. It was clear that Marcus didn't entertain guests often. Marcus, who had barely spoken since we entered, motioned for us to sit. Holmes didn't hesitate, sliding into one of the chairs with his usual fluidity. I followed, my unease growing with every passing second. The man's icy demeanor seemed to press in on me. I was keenly aware that we had entered a space where the rules were not our own. We're at Marcus's mercy now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a test, one with far higher stakes than I had initially realized. Holmes wasted no time. We need the map, he said, his voice crisp and unwavering. We know you have it. We don't have the luxury of time. Marcus's gaze flickered with something between amusement and contempt. You think you can simply walk in here and demand things, Mr. Holmes? I've heard of your reputation, but you're not the only one who can play games. His lips curled into a slow, almost predatory smile. I'll give you the map, of course, but not without a price. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Marcus's. What is your price, then? Marcus's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Not money, Mr. Holmes. I have no interest in your wealth. What I want is something far more valuable. I felt my stomach tighten at his words. And what is that? I asked, unable to keep the suspicion from creeping into my voice. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, he seemed genuinely intrigued by the question. You're not as foolish as you look. Good. What I want is a simple game, a game of wits, if you will. A test. If you can win, I'll give you the map. No questions asked. If you lose, his voice trailed off, and he let the implication hang in the air, thick and suffocating. I exchanged a glance with Holmes. It was clear that Marcus enjoyed the power he wielded in this moment. He had us where he wanted us, cornered, dependent on his mercy. But I knew that Holmes had been in situations like this before. He thrived on challenges like these, turning even the most dangerous of games to his advantage. Look back. Marcus, trying to mask my unease. What's the game? I asked, my voice steady, though I could feel the tension coiling within me. Marcus's eyes gleamed. It's simple enough. I'll ask you a series of questions, riddles, to be exact. Answer them correctly, and you will walk away with the map. Fail to answer even one, and he let the words hang in the air. Find yourselves out of your depth. Understand? Holmes remained silent for a moment, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table as he thought. Then, without missing a beat, he leaned forward. We accept your game, Marcus, but I warn you, you may find it difficult to outwit me. The tension in the room thickened as Marcus settled into a chair across from us, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. He was in control now, and it was clear he enjoyed every moment of it. Very well, Marcus said, his voice low and measured. Let's begin. The first question came swiftly, almost too quickly. What has a heart that doesn't beat? Marcus asked, his voice smooth, betraying no emotion. Holmes's eyes flickered to me for just a moment before turning back. To Marcus, an artichoke, he replied, his tone calm and confident. Marcus's lips twitched, but he nodded. Correct, he said, though his tone seemed to carry a hint of disappointment, as though he had expected us to fail sooner. The next question came moments later, more difficult this time. The more you take, the more you leave behind. Am I? Holmes's brow furrowed for the briefest of moments, as if he were momentarily lost in thought. But then his face cleared, and he answered, footsteps. Marcus leaned back in his chair, clearly impressed, though he gave no outward sign of it. Correct again? You're good at this, Holmes. But let's see how you do with this one. What comes once in a minute, twice in a moment, but never in 1,000 years? Holmes didn't miss a beat. The letter M. Marcus's smile tightened, but there was no malice behind it. He was enjoying this, perhaps even respecting Holmes's intellect. You're on a roll, Mr. Holmes, but let's see if you can answer this final one. I am not alive, but I grow. I don't have lungs, but I need air. What am I? Holmes's eyes sharpened, but he remained as composed as ever. He stared at Marcus for a moment, considering the words carefully. Could see the wheels turning in his mind, and then, with quiet certainty, he said, fire. There was a long, pregnant silence that followed. Marcus sat back, his fingers tapping the table rhythmically, as if contemplating the next move. Finally, he nodded, a slow, almost reluctant movement. Well done, Mr. Holmes, he said, his tone almost respectful. You've passed my test. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Holmes gave me a brief glance, his expression unreadable, but I could see the flicker of relief in his eyes. The game had been intense, but Holmes had managed to stay one step ahead of Marcus the entire time. Marcus stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. I must admit, I'm impressed. I didn't think you'd make it this far. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, weathered map, handing it to Holmes with a nod. Here's the map you sought. But remember, Mr. Holmes, not all games are so easily won. You've won this one, but be prepared. A society doesn't take kindly to those who pry too deeply into its secrets. Holmes took the map, his eyes scanning it quickly. Thank you, Marcus. We'll be on our way. But as we turned to leave, Marcus's voice stopped us. One more thing, Mr. Holmes. The society's reach is vast. You may have won this game, but you haven't won the war. The ritual is still coming, and you won't be able to stop it. But you might just be able to delay it. For now. Holmes didn't reply immediately. He simply nodded and turned toward the door. We stepped out into the cold night air, the map clutched tightly in Holmes's hand. We had won the game, but the real challenge was just beginning. The game begins. The room Marcus led us into was dimly lit, the faint flicker of lantern light casting long, uneven shadows across the bare stone walls. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and mildew, as though the place hadn't seen much use in years. The only furnishings were a few rickety chairs and a wooden table covered with various odds and ends. It was clear that Marcus didn't entertain guests often. Marcus, who had barely spoken since we entered, motioned for us to sit. Holmes didn't hesitate, sliding into one of the chairs with his usual fluidity. I followed, my unease growing with every passing second. The man's icy demeanor seemed to press in on me, and I was keenly aware that we had entered a space where the rules were not our own. We were at Marcus's mercy now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a test, one with far higher stakes than I had initially realized. Holmes wasted no time. "We need the map," he said, his voice crisp and unwavering. "We know you have it. We don't have the luxury of time." Marcus's gaze flickered with something between amusement and contempt. "You think you can simply walk in here and demand things, Mr. Holmes? I've heard of your reputation, but you're not the only one who can play games." His lips curled into a slow, almost predatory smile. "I'll give you the map, of course, but not without a price." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Marcus's. "What is your price, then?" Marcus's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Not money, Mr. Holmes. I have no interest in your wealth. What I want is something far more valuable." I felt my stomach tighten at his words. "And what is that?" I asked, unable to keep the suspicion from creeping into my voice. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time he seemed genuinely intrigued by the question. "You're not as foolish as you look. Good. What I want is a simple game of wits, if you will. A test. If you can win, I'll give you the map. No questions asked. If you lose..." His voice trailed off, and he let the implication hang in the air, thick and suffocating. I exchanged a glance with Holmes. It was clear that Marcus enjoyed the power he wielded in this moment. He had us where he wanted us cornered, dependent on his mercy. But I knew that Holmes had been in situations like this before. He thrived on challenges like these, turning even the most dangerous of games to his advantage. Look back. Marcus, trying to mask my unease. "What's the game?" I asked, my voice steady, though I could feel the tension coiling within me. Marcus's eyes gleamed. "It's simple enough. I'll ask you a series of questions, riddles, to be exact. Answer them correctly, and you will walk away with the map. Fail to answer even one, and..." He let the words hang in the air. "Find yourselves out of your depth. Understand?" Holmes remained silent for a moment, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table as he thought. Then, without missing a beat, he leaned forward. "We accept your game, Marcus, but I warn you, you may find it difficult to outwit me." The tension in the room thickened as Marcus settled into a chair across from us, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. He was in control now, and it was clear he enjoyed every moment of it. "Very well," Marcus said, his voice low and measured. "Let's begin." The first question came swiftly, almost too quickly. "What has a heart that doesn't beat?" Marcus asked, his voice smooth, betraying no emotion. Holmes's eyes flickered to me for just a moment before turning back to Marcus. "An artichoke," he replied, his tone calm and confident. Marcus's lips twitched, but he nodded. "Correct," he said, though his tone seemed to carry a hint of disappointment, as though he had expected us to fail sooner. The next question came moments later, more difficult this time. "The more you take, the more you leave behind. What am I?" Holmes's brow furrowed for the briefest of moments, as if he were momentarily lost in thought. But then his face cleared, and he answered, "Footsteps." Marcus leaned back in his chair, clearly impressed, though he gave no outward sign of it. "Correct again. You're good at this, Holmes. Let's see how you do with this one. What comes once in a minute, twice in a moment, but never in 1,000 years?" Holmes didn't miss a beat. "The letter M." Marcus's smile tightened, but there was no malice behind it. He was enjoying this, perhaps even respecting Holmes's intellect. "You're on a roll, Mr. Holmes, but let's see if you can answer this final one. I am not alive, but I grow. I don't have lungs, but I need air. What am I?" Holmes's eyes sharpened, but he remained as composed as ever. He stared at Marcus for a moment, considering the words carefully. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, and then, with quiet certainty, he said, "Fire." There was a long, pregnant silence that followed. Marcus sat back, his fingers tapping the table rhythmically, as if contemplating the next move. Finally, he nodded, a slow, almost reluctant movement. "Well done, Mr. Holmes," he said, his tone almost respectful. "You've passed my test." I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Holmes gave me a brief glance, his expression unreadable, but I could see the flicker of relief in his eyes. The game had been intense, but Holmes had managed to stay one step ahead of Marcus the entire time. Marcus stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. "I must admit, I'm impressed. I didn't think you'd make it this far." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, weathered map, handing it to Holmes with a nod. "Here's the map you sought. But remember, Mr. Holmes, not all games are so easily won. You've won this one, but be prepared. This society doesn't take kindly to those who pry too deeply into its secrets." Holmes took the map, his eyes scanning it quickly. "Thank you, Marcus. We'll be on our way." But as we turned to leave, Marcus's voice stopped us. "One more thing, Mr. Holmes. The society's reach is vast. You may have won this game, but you haven't won the war. The ritual is still coming, and you won't be able to stop it. But you might just be able to delay it, for now." Holmes didn't reply immediately. He simply nodded and turned toward the door. We stepped out into the cold night air, the map clutched tightly in Holmes's hand. We had won the game, but the real challenge was just beginning. As ChatGPT said, the path unveiled the night air outside. Marcus's hideout was biting, and the fog that had hung over the city seemed even thicker than before, swallowing the streets in its oppressive embrace. Holmes held the map tightly in his hand, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the ancient parchment as we walked toward the waiting carriage. The weight of the game we had just played with Marcus still hung heavily between us, but now, with the map in hand, the true nature of our task was more apparent than ever. "We've won the map," Holmes said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled over us. His voice was as measured as ever, but I could sense an undercurrent of urgency beneath his calm exterior. "But the real question is, what does it lead to?" I glanced at the map in Holmes's hand. The ink faded with age, but still legible. The locations it marked were scattered throughout the city, and their significance was not immediately clear. They were places that, on the surface, seemed unremarkably abandoned warehouses, forgotten alleyways, and even an old chapel on the edge of the city. But Holmes had already deduced that these were no random spots. Each one held a piece of the puzzle, and we were now tasked with deciphering what it all meant. "We need to find out more about these locations," I said, my voice tight with anticipation. "We know they're tied to the society, but how? And what exactly are they preparing for with this ritual?" Holmes nodded, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he seemed lost in thought, his eyes scanning the map as though it held the answers to questions we hadn't yet thought to ask. We continued walking in silence, the only sound the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves as the carriage moved along the foggy streets. As we reached Baker Street, Holmes finally spoke again, his voice low but filled with resolve. "Society's ritual is likely to take place in one of these locations, Watson. But there's something more I'm considering." The case's words were not without weight. Kay said we could delay the ritual, but we couldn't stop it entirely. Kay, that suggests that the society is already too far along in their plans for us to intervene directly. What we need to do is understand the ritual's purpose and what it will truly cost. I stopped short, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "You think this ritual isn't just about power or control, that there's something more at stake?" Holmes turned to me, his expression shadowed in the dim light of the street lamp. "Exactly. Something deeply significant about this ritual, something that goes beyond what we've already uncovered. The society has been operating for centuries, manipulating events, people, and history itself. But what if their ultimate goal isn't just power? What if it's something more primal, something tied to the very foundation of this city. I could feel the weight of his words settle over me. The society had always seemed like a shadowy, secretive force, but now it was becoming clear that their actions weren't just about influence. They were preparing for something far greater, something that, if left unchecked, could alter the very course of history. The door to our flat creaked open, and we stepped inside, the warmth of the room offering a stark contrast to the chill outside. Holmes immediately set the map down on the table, his brow furrowed in concentration as he began to trace the various locations marked on it. I joined him, my mind racing with the implications of what we had learned. "We need to visit these locations," Holmes said, his voice firm. "We'll start with the chapel. It's the most unlikely place for a secret society to operate, which means it's likely where they've hidden something crucial." I nodded, though a growing sense of unease was settling in my chest. "But we don't know what we're looking for." Chapter 8. What if we're walking straight into a trap? Holmes paused, meeting my gaze with an intensity that I couldn't ignore. "Then we walk into it together, Watson. The truth is within our grasp, but it won't be easy to uncover. The society is expecting us to search for answers, but they don't yet know how far we're willing to go to find them." The chapel, though quiet and seemingly abandoned, was located on the outskirts of the city, hidden away from the more frequented areas of London. Its worn stone walls stood stark against the surrounding overgrown vegetation, and the building seemed to have been forgotten by time itself. As we approached the entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The silence of the area was unnerving, as though the chapel itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Holmes moved with his usual deliberation, his footsteps echoing in the silence as he pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside of the chapel was dimly lit by the faint glow of candles, their flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, and the atmosphere felt thick with the weight of forgotten rituals. "We're looking for any sign of recent activity," Holmes said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Anything that indicates this place has been used for more than religious purposes." I nodded, stepping carefully through the pews as I scanned the room. The stone floor was cracked in places, and the stained glass windows were faded and in disrepair. The place had an air of neglect, but there was something about the way the candles burned so precisely, so evenly, that made me uneasy. It felt as though the chapel had been waiting for something. Holmes's eyes were sharp as he moved toward the altar. There was something there, something unusual. He knelt beside the stone slab, his fingers brushing over the surface. "This," he said, his voice barely above a murmur, "isn't just an altar. It's a marker. The ritual must be performed here, in this very spot." I stepped closer, my heart racing. But why here? What's so special about this chapel? Holmes stood up slowly, his face shadowed in thought. "This chapel has been hidden in plain sight, Watson. No one would ever suspect that a secret society would operate here in the heart of the city's oldest district. But that's the key to their power. They blend in, hiding in places where no one thinks to look." As he stood, his gaze shifted toward a small door at the back of the chapel, one that I hadn't noticed before. The door was ancient, its wooden surface scarred by age, but it seemed out of place against the otherwise worn interior of the chapel. "We need to check that door," Holmes said. "It may lead us to the heart of the society's activities." We moved toward it cautiously, the heavy silence of the chapel pressing down on us with each step. As Holmes reached for the handle, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. There was something in the errant electric charge, as though the very building was holding its breath, waiting for us to make our next move. With a slow, deliberate motion, Holmes turned the handle and pushed the door open. Beyond it lay a narrow, stone staircase that spiraled downward into the darkness. The air was cool and damp, and the faint smell of earth and decay filled the space. Holmes motioned for me to follow, and we descended into the unknown. I couldn't help but wonder what we were about to uncover. The truth was within reach, but it felt as though we were walking straight into a nightmare. The ritual, the society, see, it was all coming to a head. And whatever awaited us in the depths of this chapel would change everything. A path unveiled. The night air outside Marcus's hideout was biting, and the fog that had hung over the city seemed even thicker than before, swallowing the streets in its oppressive embrace. Holmes held the map tightly in his hand, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the ancient parchment as we walked toward the waiting carriage. The weight of the game we had just played with Marcus still hung heavily between us, but now, with the map in hand, the true nature of our task was more apparent than ever. "We've won the map," Holmes said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled over us. His voice was as measured as ever, but I could sense an undercurrent of urgency beneath his calm exterior. "But the real question is, what does it lead to?" I glanced at the map in Holmes's hand. The ink faded with age, but still legible. The locations it marked were scattered throughout the city, and their significance was not immediately clear. There were places that, on the surface, seemed unremarkably abandoned warehouses, forgotten alleyways, and even an old chapel on the edge of the city. But Holmes had already deduced that these were no random spots. Each one held a piece of the puzzle, and we were now tasked with deciphering what it all meant. "We need to find out more about these locations," I said, my voice tight with anticipation. "We know they're tied to the society, but how? And what exactly are they preparing for with this ritual?" Holmes nodded, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he seemed lost in thought, his eyes scanning the map as though it held the answers to questions we hadn't yet thought to ask. We continued walking in silence. The only sound the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves as the carriage moved along the foggy streets. As we reached Baker Street, Holmes finally spoke again, his voice low but filled with resolve. "Society's ritual is likely to take place in one of these locations, Watson. But there's something more I'm considering." Marcus's words were not without weight. He said, "We could delay the ritual, but we couldn't stop it entirely. I suggest that the society is already too far along in their plans for us to intervene directly. What we need to do is understand the ritual's purpose and what it will truly cost." I stopped short, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "You think this ritual isn't just about power or control? That there's something more at stake?" Holmes turned to me, his expression shadowed in the dim light of the street lamp. "Exactly. Something deeply significant about this ritual. Something that goes beyond what we've already uncovered. The society has been operating for centuries, manipulating events, people, and history itself. But what if their ultimate goal isn't just power? What if it's something more primal, something tied to the very foundation of this city?" If I could feel the weight of his words settle over me. The society had always seemed like a shadowy, secretive force, but now it was becoming clear that their actions weren't just about influence. They were preparing for something far greater, something that, if left unchecked, could alter the very course of history. The door to our flat creaked open, and we stepped inside, the warmth of the room offering a stark contrast to the chill outside. Holmes immediately set the map down on the table, his brow furrowed in concentration as he began to trace the various locations marked on it. I joined him, my mind racing with the implications of what we had learned. "We need to visit these locations," Holmes said, his voice firm. "We'll start with the chapel. It's the most unlikely place for a secret society to operate, which means it's likely where they've hidden something crucial." I nodded, though a growing sense of unease was settling in my chest. "But we don't know what we're looking for. What if we're walking straight into a trap?" Holmes paused, meeting my gaze with an intensity that I couldn't ignore. Then we walk into it together, Watson. The truth is within our grasp, but it won't be easy to uncover. The society is expecting us to search for answers, but they don't yet know how far we're willing to go to find them. The chapel, though quiet and seemingly abandoned, was located on the outskirts of the city, hidden away from the more frequented areas of London. Its worn stone walls stood stark against the surrounding overgrown vegetation, and the building seemed to have been forgotten by time itself. As we approached the entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The silence, or the area, was unnerving, as though the chapel itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Holmes moved with his usual deliberation, his footsteps echoing in the silence as he pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside of the chapel was dimly lit by the faint glow of candles, their flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, and the atmosphere felt thick with the weight of forgotten rituals. "We're looking for any sign of recent activity," Holmes said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Anything that indicates this place has been used for more than religious purposes." I nodded, stepping carefully through the pews as I scanned the room. The stone floor was cracked in places, and the stained glass windows were faded and in disrepair. The place had an air of neglect. But there was something about it, something about the way the candles burned so precisely, so evenly, that made me uneasy. It felt as though the chapel had been waiting for something. Holmes's eyes were sharp as he moved toward the altar. There was something there, something unusual. He knelt beside the stone slab, his fingers brushing over the surface. "This," he said, his voice barely above a murmur, "isn't just an altar. It's a marker. The ritual must be performed here, in this very spot." I stepped closer, my heart racing. But why here? What's so special about this chapel? Holmes stood up slowly, his face shadowed in thought. "This chapel has been hidden in plain sight, Watson. No one would ever suspect that a secret society would operate here in the heart of the city's oldest district. But that's the key to their power. They blend in, hiding in places where no one thinks to look." As he stood, his gaze shifted toward a small door at the back of the chapel, one that I hadn't noticed before. The door was ancient, its wooden surface scarred by age, but it seemed out of place against the otherwise worn interior of the chapel. "We need to check that door," Holmes said. "It may lead us to the heart of the society's activities." We moved toward it cautiously, the heavy silence of the chapel pressing down on us with each step. As Holmes reached for the handle, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. There was something in the errant electric charge, as though the very building was holding its breath, waiting for us to make our next move. With a slow, deliberate motion, Holmes turned the handle and pushed the door open. Beyond it lay a narrow stone staircase that spiraled downward into the darkness. The air was cool and damp, and the faint smell of earth and decay filled the space. Holmes motioned for me to follow, and we descended into the unknown. I couldn't help but wonder what we were about to uncover. The truth was within reach, but it felt as though we were walking straight into a nightmare. The ritual, the society, it was all coming to a head. And whatever awaited us in the depths of this chapel would change everything. Into the depths, the staircase wound downward in tight spirals. The faintest flicker of torchlight casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Every step we took seemed to deepen the silence that had settled over us, as if the very earth beneath our feet was holding its breath. The air grew colder with each descent, thick with the scent of dampness and centuries of hidden secrets. It was clear now we had stumbled upon something far older, far more significant than we had anticipated. Holmes led the way, his expression as focused as ever, while I followed closely behind, my senses alert to every sound, every movement. The further we descended, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, pushing us towards some unknown destination. The light from the single torch we had lit barely illuminated the narrow path before us. But I knew that we were nearing something monumental. At the bottom of the staircase, we reached a small, circular chamber, its walls lined with ancient symbols and carvings that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The floor was cold and uneven, and at the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, upon which rested a large, weathered book. The sight of it made my pulse quicken. This was no ordinary book. It was the very one Mr. Howard had been searching for, the one that had been mentioned in Stokes's notes, the book that held the key to the society's secrets. Holmes stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the book. "This is it," he said, his voice low but filled with awe. "The rights of the forgotten kings. The society's power is tied to this book, and to whatever knowledge it contains." I moved closer, my heart racing. The room seemed to hum with an ancient energy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, observed by eyes that had been waiting for this moment for centuries. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation, as though the book itself was calling to us. Holmes reached out and gently touched the cover of the book, his fingers brushing against the worn leather. "We must be careful, Watson," he said quietly. "This book may hold the answers we seek, but it may also contain traps, spiritual, psychological, or even physical. The society would not have hidden it here unless they were willing to go to great lengths to protect it." I nodded, though I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward the book. It seemed to radiate a quiet, undeniable power, as though it held the keys to not just this mystery, but to something much greater, something that could alter the course of history itself. Holmes stepped back, his eyes scanning the room once more. "Before we open it, we need to understand how the society intends to use it. Okay, the ritual is their ultimate goal, and this book is the vessel that will carry it out. We need to know what we're dealing with." I agreed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we had already stepped too far into this world of shadows. The ritual, the society. See, it was all coming together in a way I hadn't fully understood until now. This was no longer just a case. It was a battle for the very soul of the city, and the stakes were higher than we could have imagined. Holmes moved toward one of the walls, his eyes flicking over the ancient symbols etched into the stone. "These markings," he said, pointing to the symbols, "are part of the ritual. They serve as both a guide and a warning. I believe that the society has used them for centuries to protect the book and its contents. They are a map of sorts, a way to unlock the power within the book." He studied the symbols for a long moment, his fingers tracing their edges as though trying to decipher their meaning. Key symbols are not just ancient, they are living. They have a purpose, a direction. They must be read in the right order, or the consequences could be catastrophic. I watched Holmes closely, the tension building between us. Every instinct I had was telling me that we were walking on the edge of something dangerous, something we could never fully understand, but we were too close now to turn back. We had to find the answers, even if it meant confronting the full power of the society. Holmes turned toward me, his face grim. "We cannot open the book until we have deciphered these symbols, Watson. The ritual is a delicate process, and any misstep could set it into motion before we're ready. We need to understand what we're up against." I nodded, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the symbols. "But how do we decipher them? They're unlike anything I've seen before." Holmes smiled, though it was more of a tight-lipped gesture than one of amusement. "These symbols are not random, Watson. They follow a pattern, one that I've encountered before. It's a form of ancient script, a language that predates even the oldest records of London. I'll need time to work through it, but I believe I can unlock the meaning." As Holmes worked, I took a step back, my gaze sweeping across the room. There was something undeniably unsettling about this place. The energy in the air was thick, almost tangible, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was as though the very walls were watching us, waiting for the next move. Finally, after what felt like hours, Holmes looked up from the symbols, his face filled with a quiet intensity. "I've done it," he said, his voice steady. "The symbols are part of the ritual leads. One corresponds to a specific element of the society's power. The first step is to unlock the book's physical form. The second step is to invoke the ritual's power through the symbols themselves." I moved closer to the book, my heart pounding in my chest. "And what happens once the ritual is complete?" Holmes's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "Once the ritual is complete, Watson, the society will gain control over the city in a way we can't even begin to understand. The power contained in this book is not just about influence, it's about domination. The ritual will bind the city's leaders to the society, ensuring their control for generations." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the full scale of what we were dealing with. This was not just a case of secret power, it was a fight for the soul of London itself. Holmes stepped forward, reaching for the book. "We must stop them before it's too late." As his fingers brushed the cover, a low, vibrating hum filled the room, and the stone walls seemed to shift around us. The air grew thick with energy, and I felt a sudden surge of unease. The book was awakening. "Be careful," I warned, my voice shaking as I grabbed his arm. But it was too late. The book had already begun to pulse, its pages turning on their own, the symbols glowing with an otherworldly light. We had crossed the point of no return. The ritual had begun.